So let me pick up a little bit where Harley left off, because if you actually look at, as he indicated, the recent attacks on LaRouche by name, which is a change in the way the establishment media has treated us, has come from the key newspapers of the financier elite, the fascist financier elite, Wall Street, London, and Zurich, Switzerland. And of course, as you know, what they are completely freaked out about by name is this Children of Satan pamphlet. So they're not just throwing names at LaRouche, which used to be the way they would attack him if they bothered to mention his name, but rather having to substantively respond to what we say in this pamphlet, which is that Wolfowitz, Cheney, and the rest of these guys are fascists. In other words, we give a brand name to the disease, or we identify the virus with very clinical specificity. And I remember when the day that the war with Iraq started, you were either angry or demoralized or pessimistic or all of the above, and so on. And of course, Lynn knew we were all pessimistic, freaked out, angry, etc. So he, one of our coordinators said to Lynn, well, what do we do? What do I say to people? And Lynn said, what are you worried about? I'm in control. I know what I'm doing. He said, we're going to get Strauss. Now, when I heard that, I said, huh? How is getting Strauss, who I didn't know a whole lot about at the time, actually going to have any effect on the fact that we're dropping bombs on Iraq, and that Cheney seemed to be completely unstoppable. We had mobilized against this for a year and a half. We jammed it up. We had the rest of the world saying, hell no, we won't go. And yet they went ahead and did it anyway. But Lynn was very calm, very serene, and said, I know what I'm doing. We're going to get Strauss. He knew that, in a sense, this was their high watermark, kind of like Picketts Charge at Gettysburg. That was the farthest the Confederacy ever got north. This was their high watermark. They were completely exposed at that point. They had succeeded in doing it on the basis of lies, but they were out there in front of the entire world. And he knew it was going to be a disaster, ultimately, that chaos would ensue afterwards, as it has, and so on. But he also knew, he knew that this was the moment, really, to paste the brand name on this faction, to paste the name of fascism on this faction, and look at the impact of that since then. The major establishment publications are now essentially following in LaRouche's wake, attacking Strauss, attacking these guys, and so on, to the point that the Wall Street Journal, in its op-ed attack against LaRouche, basically said, LaRouche is manipulating the New York Times. Now, that's pretty funny, since the New York Times helped put LaRouche in jail, in 1989. But in a sense, it was true, because LaRouche had identified a dangerous virus, a Frankenstein, which even sections of the establishment had to recognize, because they'd actually seen it once before in the previous century. And so just at the point when these guys were probably having wet dreams about world fascist domination, we go out on the streets with this little 24-page pamphlet, and before you know it, they're at least stalemated. They're no longer on the ascendancy. Now, they have to be defeated, and what Harley outlined is the next step in this. And there's a very real historical parallel to the kind of situation that we're in today, because what LaRouche has done, what LaRouche is doing, is waging the same kind of fight, although frankly from probably a much higher intellectual level, that Franklin Roosevelt waged. Because if you look at what happened in the 1930s, late 1920s, 1930s, you had the collapse of the world financial system. And at that point, and today, there are only basically two pathways you can take when your world financial system collapses, or your financial system. One is the one that Franklin Roosevelt took, which is you use the power of the nation state to defend the people, to defend the nation, and you tell the bankers, you get in the back of the bus because you are not going to set the policy. You caused the collapse. We're not going to let you set the policy to manage the collapse. We're going to build our way out of this depression. Roosevelt mobilized the sovereign power of a nation state to rescue the country from the depression. But the same thing didn't happen in Europe. As Harley pointed out, there are no republics truly in Europe. There's countries which will use the word, like the Federal Republic of Germany, and so on. But none of these are republics in the sense of our republic, where the principle of the general welfare is the guiding, governing principle of the nation. So you have, as Harley said, you have today at best parliamentary democracies. Back at the beginning of the century, you had countries which had just barely gotten out of monarchies and so on. You didn't have a lot of really functional republics in Europe in 1929 or 1932. And so how did they solve how did they address the financial crisis? They turned to the bankers. And they said, well, it's a financial crisis and you're bankers, so you should know how to fix the financial crisis. And what the bankers, and in particular the hardcore Synergist bankers, and I'll get back to exactly what we're talking about there, what they said is, okay, well, we're going to save us at the expense of you. And the crisis being as deep as it was, they knew that meant people were going to die. They knew that you were only going to get away with that with dictatorships. And so what did you see in Europe? It wasn't just Hitler. You had dictatorships all over Europe. You had Mussolini, you had Franco in Spain, you had the Stalinist dictatorship in Russia, in the Soviet Union, these were not all under the control of the Synergists at all times. Most of them had been launched by the bankers. Some of them got out of control, some of them didn't. But what you had in Europe is you basically had dictatorships all over Europe as a response to this financial crisis. So what happened? Some of those very bankers who helped bankroll Adolf Hitler woke up one morning and found Nazi bombs being dropped on London. So things had not exactly turned out the way they intended. Hitler became a Frankenstein monster. The evil of the ideology that he represented, in a sense, took on a life of its own. So the very same London bankers who hated Roosevelt had to go screaming to Roosevelt to save them from the Nazis. And it was only because, the world was saved from fascism in the 1930s and the 1940s because of the United States of America. Because Roosevelt had ended the Depression, had mobilized the productive potential of the United States. And what the American contribution to defeating the Nazis was not that we were better soldiers. The Germans were much better trained soldiers. The American contribution ultimately was our industrial power, our ability to produce the material that was needed to wage a many-year-long fight. My mother and father met building bombers in Detroit in the 1940s at Willow Run. And when the war began, when the mobilization began in 1942, they were producing, I think, 5 Liberator bombers a week. And within a year, they were producing 20 a day. That's what the United States could do. And that's what defeated Hitler. But it was every time I see a little Liberator bomber, I get real familial. And so we defeated the Nazis. But the fascist bankers, the Synergists, who had set this evil process in motion, even though it got kind of a little bit out of their control, at least out of some of their control, when the war was over, they didn't give up. In fact, I was recently just looking at some research on the Synergists, and I ran into a quote from one of these guys from the 1950s, basically saying, well, we plan on reversing the defeat of World War II by the 21st century. In other words, they intended to reestablish world fascism by right about now. But what did they know? They knew what had defeated them. They knew it was the United States. They knew it was Roosevelt. And they knew the reason that Roosevelt was able to actually do what he did is because he created a new mass political movement in the United States. It was the Roosevelt Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party, which elected Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, was different than the Democratic Party had ever been before. The Democratic Party throughout the 19th century had been the party of the Confederacy and the bankers. It was not exactly the party of the common man. The Republican Party of Lincoln had been the party which defended the nation, but that was destroyed after the assassination of McKinley at the beginning of the century. And actually for about 30 years in the United States, you really didn't have a party that represented the interests of this nation. The Republican Party was being destroyed. The Democratic Party had never been any damn good. And it's one of the reasons things were as bad as they were in the United States and in the world in the first third of the last century. But Roosevelt created a new institution, the Franklin Roosevelt Democratic Party. So these fascist bankers sort of, quietly regrouped after World War II. And they knew that the next time there was a financial collapse, and they know that they always create financial collapses, they're not stupid. They knew that the next time there was a financial collapse, they had to have the United States on their side, instead of the United States being the nation that was fighting against fascism. And they knew to do that, they had to get the Democratic Party. And in reality, the Synergist, Straussian, fascist deployment started earlier in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. Because frankly, the Republican Party, they knew, the modern-day Republican Party will never be a mass-based opposition to fascism. There is resistance in it to Cheney and these guys, as Lynn has said. In fact, right now there's more resistance in the Republican Party than in the Democratic Party. But that's not going to defeat fascism. That's why we're not going to get rid of Cheney until LaRouche is leading the Democratic Party. So this movement, the Straussians, the Synergists, have been deploying for the entire post-war period in one form or another to figure out how to capture the Democratic Party. What Harley was describing in terms of what happened to Pete Williams in the Senate was in the early 1980s. At least a half a dozen other congressmen, Democratic congressmen, were driven out of the Congress or the Senate under abscam or Brylab. There were various other operations run where the old-line Democrats, FDR-type Democrats, who had powerful positions in the Senate Banking Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committee, and Williams was the Senate Labor Committee, and so on, were set up in one form or another for defeat, and gotten out of there. So the Roosevelt tradition in the Democratic Party was in a sense being purged. At the same time, they were setting up the Democratic Leadership Council to then step in and essentially take the Democratic Party over. I used to do our Capitol Hill work, and back in the 1970s and the 80s, now on reflection, I now understand this very strange anomaly. I mean, when we first went up to Capitol Hill, we were still the U.S. Labor Party, so we weren't exactly conservative, Yet we got a better response to LaRouche's ideas of growth and development and so on and so forth from Republicans than we did from Democrats. And even more so, the most vitriolic hatred of LaRouche came from a small group of staffers in Democratic offices, like Richard Pearl, who was in Scoop Jackson's office. Jackson was a right-wing Democrat. And I used to have screaming matches with Richard Pearl, over policies. And I didn't know why he didn't like us so much. I mean, I understood why people might disagree, but this guy hated us, And, other people like Shulsky, who heads the Office of Special Plans, was in Moynihan's office, a Democrat. So, I mean, these guys were in the Democratic offices much more so in the late 70s and the 80s than the Republicans, because the fascists, the Synergists, consider the Democratic Party to be a much greater threat, potentially because of the composition of the base of the Democratic Party, to fascism than they do the Republican Party, although there is there is an element of at least semi-sanity in the Republican Party. So, because they wanted to be in a position when the next financial collapse hits, that the United States is their enforcement. The United States is their Nazi Germany, to try and impose fascism on the rest of the world. So here we are with the financial collapse hitting, and they had pushed this process very, very far, and in comes Lyndon LaRouche. None of this, of course, taking him by surprise, because for those of us who, joined the movement, 3 decades ago, he was warning about fascism in 1971, and, it seemed like a very abstract thing to be warning about in 1971, but he understood that once you become a parasitical society, at the end of that pathway, someday, somewhere, if you don't get off it, you're going to end up with fascism. So I sometimes get the feel, I get the image of Lynn as kind of like a heat-seeking missile. He's looking. He's always looking for that which will actually give him, what he needs. And he was just looking for this Strauss question. I mean, you could just, because again, it's absolutely not self-evident why attacking Leo Strauss was going to change world history, but it was absolutely self-evident to Lynn that he was going to. Now, so it is right now LaRouche versus this fascist banker elite versus this Synergist movement. Now, which is not at all surprising, because LaRouche represents the quintessence of the American intellectual tradition, the ideas of classical Greece, and so on. And the Synergist movement represent the opposite. When we were first recently beginning to review the whole Synergist file, and most of us were saying, I don't even know what the word means, what is he talking about, and so on. He said, well, look, what you really have to understand is that Synergism was born in July 1st, 1776, in the sense that the minute the Declaration of Independence was signed and conceived, you had at least the idea of a Synergist movement, even though the Synergist movement per se, in its current form, wasn't formed until about the 1870s. Because once the idea of the United States of America, embodied in the Declaration of Independence, and then created as a real nation with the Constitution of the United States, this oligarchical banking outlook knew that they had a mortal enemy that they were going to have to defeat. And for the first 100 years after our nation's existence, they tried some rather obvious ways to get rid of us, like the War of 1812, the Civil War, and so on and so forth. But the Civil War didn't work. I mean, even though they assassinated Lincoln, we won the Civil War. We came out of the Civil War as the greatest producing power on the planet. And other nations were beginning to follow in the wake of the United States: Japan, Russia, Germany, France, and so on. So the international bankers basically said, we got to go back to the drawing board. We're not going to defeat the idea of the United States and the Republic just with raw force. We're going to have to figure out a way to, number one, destroy all nation states. And that really is the idea of what synarchy is. If you haven't thought about how the word actually works, it helped me figure it out, because you know the word anarchy, which means without government. Synarchy, S-I-N, is the Greek prefix for with. So it's with government, but it's not just with government, it's with government. I mean, it's total world domination of the bankers, by the bankers, and for the bankers. So synarchy was created. The Synergist movement is a bankers' movement, as Harley said, created to destroy sovereign nations. And so they began financing and backing these different dictatorships. The top Synergist oversaw the assassination of the Tsar, which led to the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, Lenin was not a Synergist, and he kind of took things in a direction that the Synergists didn't like. So that's not to say they were running the Soviet Union throughout that entire period, but an American-style republic was potential in Russia at the turn of the century. And with the Bolshevik Revolution, they succeeded. They succeeded in ensuring that Russia and the United States were pretty much at each other's throats for the entirety of the 20th century. So, and then, of course, the fascist dictatorships and so on. So, the mortal enemy of Synergism is the nation state. but the idea embodied in the nation state, the idea embodied in our Constitution, the idea embodied in the Republic, which is that man is created above the animals in the image of a creator. And that means his mind, and his mind can comprehend principles in the universe and exert greater dominion over society and nature because our mind can comprehend these ideas. The idea of a republic is very, very specific in the following sense. The highest law is universal laws, higher than, quote, constitutional laws, like you can sit there and interpret a section of the Constitution this way, or you can interpret it that way, and so on, and you could have some big fights about that. What is the highest law? The only reason to have a fight over the interpretation of something in the Constitution is figure out which understanding of that idea brings your country back into conformity with universal principles. Those are the highest laws. And that is the idea of a republic. And that is what the Synarchists absolutely hate and want to destroy. As Lynn referenced it in something, he described the Synarchist and Straussian thinking as taking a bad idea or a wrong idea and taking it into a military weapons laboratory and turning it into a weapons-grade pathogen. And that's essentially what Synarchism is. That essentially is why it becomes fascism under almost any set of circumstances, and it becomes very evil and often ends up becoming a kind of Frankenstein quality which turns around and bites the butt of some of the people who might have financed it in an earlier period of time. So this question of Synarchism, it's important to look at the underlying axioms, try and look into the mind in a certain sense of these Synarchists, because this is the mortal enemy of the United States. And everything that has happened in this country bad, like the assassination of John Kennedy, it's the Synarchists. I mean, there's different elements of it, organized crime, KGB, CIA, all of these different pieces of it. But what you find is when you go up the food chain of what has actually organized something, like the assassination of Kennedy, you're going to find institutions which are directly deployed by the Synarchists. Now, I wasn't particularly doing research on Synarchism. I was continuing the research on ancient Egypt, which was the basis for a couple of recent classes I gave. When a couple of weeks ago, Jeff Steinberg, head of our intelligence in Leesburg, ran up to me and handed me a report off the internet on Synarchism. It said, flip to page 7. So I flipped to page 7. And it was describing a particular Synarchist named René Schwaller de Lubitsch. I'll put his name on the board in a minute. And as the father of alternative Egyptology, or the father of the idea that Egypt is much older than 2600 BC, that it goes back to 10,000 BC, that there was great knowledge and learning in Egypt which has been suppressed, that this was the basis of the classical Greek period, and so on. And this is how Schwaller is basically portrayed as the father of alternative Egypt. But this was an article on Synarchism, and it pointed out that inexplicably the father of alternative Egypt happened to be a leading Synarchist. So Schwaller was born, I think, in the 1870s. I'll write his name on the board. In Alsace, France. Somebody want to get one that's actually going to write? Yeah. Yeah, that's the one that counts. I hope that doesn't mean they stop putting money on the board. So that's his given name. And then he did some service to a Lithuanian count in 1913. And he was knighted, and that's where he got the de Lubitsch. So that's most of his books are under the name of Schwaller de Lubitsch. Now, Schwaller, it turns out, his stuff on ancient Egypt was then popularized in 1988 by this guy, John Anthony West. who wrote a book called Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt by John Anthony West. And basically this is just a discussion of Schwaller's ideas. And then off of this book, much to Dustin's dismay, Graham Hancock spins out a whole series of books like the Message of the Sphinx, the Orion Mystery, what's the name of the one you've got? Fingerprints of the Gods, etc., etc., etc. Graham Hancock is just a third-generation Schwallerian, or Lubitchian, whatever you want to call it. I think we'll go with Lubitchian. One of the other people who picks up on Schwaller is Martin Bernal, who wrote Black Athena. And that ends up being very, very ironic, as I'll get to in a minute. Because Schwaller is a synarchist. He is part of this synarchist movement. And in the 19-teens, he starts his own synarchist group called the Watchers, however you say it in French, I don't know, Velliers. And there's a fellow who's a member of the Watchers called Vivian Postal Dumal or something like that, who turns out is the person who recruits Rudolf Hess, one of Hitler's associates, to synarchism. Schwaller apparently boasts that he's the person who designed the brown shirts uniforms, because it was what he always used to wear, which was a brown shirt, riding pants, and leather boots. One of these discussions of him, which is trying to whitewash him, says, a questionable fashion statement for the early 1930s. Now, Schwaller also was a complete total racist, which is where this Martin Bernal thing is awfully funny, because Schwaller argues that there are various ages to mankind, and in each age a particular race dominates. And of course, it's a hierarchy of races. And of course, we're at the best age so far, which is the white race. He loved Egypt, however, and which is a little bit of a contradiction, because of course aren't exactly white in Egypt. He actually argued there were no blacks in ancient Egypt. I mean, just completely wacky in order to force this into, his insane worldview. As Harley said, these people are crazy. I mean, don't try and confuse them with, presenting something real to them. So here you have Martin Bernal, who, is arguing that the black culture of Egypt is the wellspring of many great ideas, which it certainly is. But then what's his argument? Greece stole it, and didn't understand it and so on. But Bernal is basically coming right out of the networks of a white racist Nazi, essentially, on this. So I had a number of Schwaller's books already. I'd already looked at them, especially his big magnum opus, which is called The Temple of Man, where he claims Pythagorean Platonic ideas as they're represented in ancient Egypt, and that they come from ancient Egypt and so on, all of which is true. But that's as far as the truth actually goes, because what he then claims are Platonic and Pythagorean ideas have absolutely nothing to do with Plato or Pythagoras. So, just as the Straussians say that they get their ideology, including you can lie to everybody to impose your dictatorship, from Plato's Republic, because they rip out of context and actually don't even translate correctly out of context a section of the Republic. They do exactly the same thing in terms of this question of what Egypt is and what Plato and Pythagoras are vis-a-vis Egypt. So it's interesting to, in a sense, look into the axioms of one of these leading synarchists from the standpoint of actually comparing it to Plato and Pythagoras, and actually looking at what Egypt really is, as opposed to what Schwaller says it actually is. So the underlying axiom, the first thing you have to do in any kind of investigation of ancient cultures or science or anything is the first question you have to ask, and it's the first point that Lyndon LaRouche makes in almost every speech he gives, is what is the nature of man and how does man actually know the universe? Now, the Synergists, the Theosophists, who are a sort of more soft-core version of Synarchy, in other words, they're not all Nazis, but they could be, and so on, these, frankly, are all just rewarmed versions of a body of ideas that existed, certainly in written form, back in the time of Plato and Socrates. Obviously, the battle between two different worldviews existed long, long before that, but it's really only in classical Greece that you have the elaboration in writing of these actual philosophical ideas. What you have in Egypt is other kinds of evidence, but it's not like you have a philosophical textbook. You've got metaphors like the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead and so on, but you actually don't have philosophical discussions that we know of from ancient Egypt. What you have is the philosophical discussions starting basically in 600, 500, 400 BC, the periods, the centuries around Socrates and Plato. So the first elaboration of the what becomes the Synergist worldview you find in the writings of the Eleatics, who were a philosophical movement in Italy in the middle of the 6th century, around 550 BC. And the most famous Eleatic for anybody who's read Plato's Dialogues is Parmenides. He's really the key Eleatic. They're called Eleatics because they settle in a place in Italy called Elia. So that's all an Eleatic is, somebody who settles in Elia. And what is it that the Eleatics and the Synergists, what is the bedrock of their axiomatic outlook? That is, you can't know the world through your senses. Well, okay, that seems pretty good so far because it's what Plato says, it's what LaRouche says, and so on. But what they, therefore, since the truth is an eternal, indescribable, unchanging, undifferentiated one, and you with your senses can only see the discrete things, discrete objects, you can never know the one. You can never know the truth. You then get two variations of this. The Eleatics and the Synergists develop an elaborate mystical pathway by which you might sidle up to the truth. It's not conscious, it's esoteric, it's mystical, and so on, and I'll go through how Schwaller actually develops this. Then you have other people who, when presented with this argument that since your senses can't know the truth, you can't know the truth, they say whatever. And that's the sophists. They're not really interested in finding the truth. They, like Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, say, well, since you can't know the truth, then, how are you going to govern society? Well, then might makes right. Whoever has the biggest army wins. Or whoever gives the most seductive speech wins, or whoever pays off the most people wins. But there's no principles, there's no standards, and so on, and they really don't care. Now, this was the battle that Plato was waging, that Socrates was waging. This was the battle that Plato documented in many, many, many of his dialogues. Because this idea, either that you can't know the truth, therefore you can't make any decisions on the basis of universal principles, or whatever, and might makes right. These two complementary ideas are what destroyed Greece in the 5th century BC. That's from 499 to 400 BC. That's the 5th century because you're BC, so you're going backwards. Got to keep that straight when you're dealing with the BC. So the great culture of Greece, which, as I discussed in previous classes, does come from the astronomical, geometrical, mathematical ideas from Egypt, which Plato acknowledges, Pythagoras acknowledges, many people acknowledge. This great culture, which had defeated the Persians, who were the modern day, or were the ancient versions of Dick Cheney. The Greeks had defeated this, had given the world a method of governing, a method of knowing the world, a great art, a great culture, a great science, and so on, they destroyed themselves. They had a civil war starting in 432 BC, and they ended up destroying themselves. Or to look at it in current terms, the British, after failing to defeat us militarily with the War of 1812 and the Civil War, unleashed this Synergist virus in the United States to try and destroy any potential allies. They released the Synergist virus everywhere in order to destroy nation states and destroy potential allies with ideas. Well, that's exactly what happened, only in the case of ancient Greece, it actually succeeded. The ideas did succeed in defeating classical Greek culture. And Plato writes his dialogues after the execution of Socrates, which in a sense was the punctuation mark at the end of classical Greece, because Socrates was executed by the leaders of Greece for what? For teaching young people to search the truth. But Socrates' death inspired his young student Plato to become a philosopher instead of what he was tracked into being by his family, which was sort of just a pragmatic politician. But Socrates' death had an enormous impact on Plato, and I think it's in part for this reason that Lynn describes Socrates' death as sublime. It's not a tragedy. It's sublime, because his death lays the basis for one of the greatest developments in all of mankind's history, which is Plato's Academy and Plato's Dialogues, without which we wouldn't have a United States of America. And what Plato discusses in his dialogues, most of these dialogues are polemics against these Eleatic, sophist, or early Synergist ideas. One of the leading sophists of the time, Protagoras, was one of the people who influenced heavily the Greek leader Pericles, who made most of the really bad mistakes. But it wasn't just the leader. It's like the United States today. These guys also influenced the population, so they tolerated and they supported bad leaders. The Gorgias dialogue is about another famous sophist. Thrasymachus in the Republic was a very famous sophist at the time. Alcibiades, a general and a political leader of Greece, who Socrates worked very hard to develop a philosophical mind, instead fell under the influence of the sophists. And he did play a very tragic role in the unfolding tragedy of Greece, and so on. And of course, as I mentioned, one of the two most challenging dialogues of Plato, which is Parmenides, is about the leading Eleatic of the time, which Plato takes very, very seriously. I mean, some of the dialogues about the sophists, like the Gorgias and Protagoras, are very rambunctious, and if you read them in the right way, they're funny. They're like brawls. They're like mental barroom brawls. Because Socrates is really, a couple of times you think a fist fight is going to break out between Socrates and Gorgias and so on. They're serious, but there's a certain, I guess it would be like Lynn debating George Bush. You got to deal with the problem, but it's not exactly where the worst of the problem is coming from. The difference is, Lynn, if he had a chance to go back and actually debate Leo Strauss, something like that. That's how Plato treated Parmenides. So these dialogues are very, very much combat manuals. Now, it's sort of ironic that Plato's most exquisite dialogue, as far as I'm concerned, the Timaeus, which is like his Ninth Symphony, essentially. You could actually call that, the way Lynn talks about the simultaneity of eternity. In the simultaneity of eternity, the Timaeus is a combat manual for dealing with the Synergists. Because all of the wacky ideas, which Schwaller and other Synergists develop, were dealt with beautifully and defeated, in a sense, in a debate in the simultaneity of eternity by these Synergists. So I'm just going to go back and forth a little bit between what Schwaller says in terms of the question of creation. because the question of the creation of the universe, and then, of course, how man could know the universe. How do you perceive the universe? How do you know what is truthful, and so on? These are fundamental epistemological questions. So, to start out with the world of the Synergist, the world of Schwaller. Schwaller's world is a very dead world, and it's a world of chaos, which he says right off the bat. This is his earliest work, the study of numbers. Not exactly up to the size of the disquisitions, is it? So it's, fairly lightweight. But he says right off the bat, whenever our spirit wishes to sift out from among the chaos of cosmic phenomenon the truth, we're going to need help. But right there, he's basically outlined that you've got the universe is chaotic. He describes it as a world of such a disorganized complexity that it could never be understood in its totality. So Schwaller's world is a very, very dead world. And this idea, again, the Eleatic idea that the truth can only be found in, not in the senses, but in a one unknowable universal, is exactly how Schwaller defines reality. He says the one which alone is real is invariable, undivided, irrational, incommensurable, uncompounded, rationally indivisible. He says it's the abstraction of all quality. So it's simply the abstraction of any kind of quality. It is an absolute state. It is a punctal one. It's like 1 point. And of course, your senses cannot comprehend something which is undivided, incommensurable, abstract, and so on and so forth. So there you are back in the world of the Eleatics, that you've got this incredible paradox. We're creatures of our senses. You've got this truth, this universal truth. You ain't never going to know it through your senses. And so he then takes it to the step which it often evolves to, the paradox between the logic of the scientist and the ecstasy of the mystic. And those are your only two choices. A cold, logical scientist and somebody on LSD. But he does want to solve this paradox, he says. So he says, solving this leads to the science of number. Number as the basic law of the universe. Now, for those of you who have worked on Gauss, that doesn't sound completely outrageous on the face of it. I mean, you could get seduced into this. In fact, when I first looked at The Temple of Man, his book, I skipped a couple of chapters because they seemed a little bit wacky. But then when he was discussing numbers and certain relationships of numbers and so on, I said, all right, it might be a little rough around the edges, but, I can get something out of this and so on. But then when I found out he was a Synergist, I figured I'd better not skip those chapters and went back and looked at them. And when you get into it, you get into how completely wacky this is. What does he mean by the idea that the science of number is the basic law of the universe? Well, here's his discussion of creation. Creation is found in the mysterious division of 1 into 2. That one, this unknowable, ineffable, one, punctal one, somehow mysteriously divides itself into 2. And the passage of 1 into 2 through this mysterious, unknowable, I think unless you're on LSD, development, this is the act of creation. This is the creative act of the universe. This is Genesis. Now, one description of Schwaller's, this by somebody who likes him. This is the Theosophical Society in America. René Schwaller de Lubitsch in The Intelligence of the Heart. Here's how they describe it, quite adequately, actually. For Schwaller, this irrational eruption of absolute unity into the world of space and time is the central mystery of existence, the primal secret that will forever elude the simplifying grasp of the purely cerebral mind. Our rational mind is unable to grasp this central mystery because our sensory organization clearly seems to be imperfect. This condition can only be alleviated through a perfecting of consciousness, something he would later argue the ancient Egyptians knew all about. But this idea, the irrational eruption of absolute unity into the world of space and time, is the definition of Genesis and creation by these guys. Now, and so he says, number is the principle of life, it's the impulse of the cosmos, it's the philosophical basis for cosmic genesis, and so on. But it's completely sterile. I mean, there's no mind, there's no nothing. There's just this irrational eruption of absolute unity into the world of space and time. Now, Schwaller and all of his buddies claim that this is Pythagoras and this is Plato, and that it comes from Egypt. And absolutely nothing could be further than the truth. Because if you actually look at the way Plato addresses the same question of creation, how can man know the universe with imperfect senses and so on? The way Plato addresses this in the Timaeus, just completely obliterates these guys. Or to put it another way, they've been trying to obliterate Plato so they could get away with this for the last 2,400 years. There's an interesting window you can get into the Timaeus as well by reading Philo of Alexandria's very short monograph on the book of Genesis. Now, who was Philo of Alexandria? He was a contemporary of St. Paul. He was an Alexandrian Jew in Alexandria, Egypt, in the 1st century B.C. And he was a Platonist, and he wrote extensive commentaries on the Old Testament from a Platonic standpoint, and also wrote something on the life of Moses. What he points out in the life of Moses and what he references in his commentary on the book of Genesis, which of course is one of the books of Moses, is of course Moses gained his learning from the Egyptian priests, because Moses was raised in the temple of Ammon in Egypt before he led the Jews out of Egypt. And what Philo says, as do many others, is that Moses' ideas about the generation of the universe come from the ancient Egyptian priesthood. Now, that's also what Plato says in the Timaeus. In the Timaeus, of course, the Timaeus begins with the discussion by Plato's relative, actually, Critias, of a story he heard from his great-grandfather, was it great-great-grandfather? Can't remember. About when Solon traveled to Egypt in around 600 BC and met with the priests of the Temple of Ammon in Egypt. And they told him, introduced him to advanced ideas in astronomy, geometry, mathematics, and so on and so forth. So both the Timaeus and Philo of Alexandria talking about Moses take you back to the same place. They take you back to the ideas of ancient Egypt in terms of these creation ideas and so on. And this is what I'm about to develop in terms of Plato and Philo. This is the legacy of Egypt, not the insanity which Schwaller de Lubitsch and the rest of these Theosophists described in terms of Egypt. So what is the very first key axiomatic difference between Plato and Philo on the one side and Schwaller on the other? Well, of course, in the Synergist universe, there is no creator. There is no composer, as Plato calls him in the Timaeus. There is no God, as Philo calls him in discussion of the book of Genesis. You just have a very dead universe in which some indescribable one indescribably divides into two, and from that you construct number and everything else. but there is no intention, there is no composer. And Philo, in discussing it, puts it quite beautifully. He says there must be a cause for the creation of the universe, and he says the active cause is the intellect of the universe, thoroughly unadulterated and thoroughly unmixed, superior to virtue, science, even to abstract good or abstract beauty. So Plato, in the Timaeus, discusses the same idea as the eternal, that which exists eternally, that which is not created because it exists eternally, that which is undifferentiated, it's the same, it's unchanging, and so on. Now, if you're feeling a little uneasy, thinking maybe we're talking about Schwaller's one here, I mean, that's what he would like you to think. But what both Plato and Philo then develop is that for the Creator, this eternal image is simply the paradigm for which he is going to create creation. That is, you have an eternal paradigm, you have an archetype, which he ends up simply taking the idea and calling it the same. But that which is eternal, that which is not created, what Philo calls God, and so on, that is your archetype, that is your paradigm. And then he models creation on the basis of that paradigm. But both he and Philo, right off the bat, say something very, very important. While this idea of the eternal, or this idea of an idea which is a model or a paradigm, is not knowable to the senses, it is knowable to your mind, or at least hypothesizing about it and examining it and so on is knowable to your mind. And what Plato develops in the Timaeus, which in a sense blows Schwaller and the Theosophists right out of the water, is very, very simple concept. We're not simply our senses. We have the capacity to see things not through our senses, like justice. You know, can anybody point to justice or smell justice? I mean, you can smell injustice when you're around John Ashcroft, probably. But you know, these concepts, beauty is not something which is tangible. You could talk about a beautiful person, but the concept of beauty is not something which exists for your senses. You have a different capacity, which is the capacity to know things through your mind. And what you run into throughout the Timaeus, and then Philo also picks up on it, although I only have the Philo in English, but in the Timaeus, the Greek has a beautiful way of making a concept very simple, which we have to express in a lot of words. So, what did I do with her? Or did they come and get it?
It could be hiding in the tree.
Yes, it is. I'm going to do it in Greek first because I can never spell it in English unless I put it in Greek. This is knowable to the mind. And this is knowable to the eyes. Or it's really that which is mindable and that which is seeable, but I'm spelling it out a little bit more. So again, for the Synergists, this doesn't exist. There's nothing that you can actually know through your mind. All you are is a creature of your senses. Because, of course, they want you to be an animal so that they can control you. They don't want you to know that you've got a mind and that you can know principles, you can know ideas, you can exert power over the universe through your mind. They want you to think that you've only got the knowledge of your senses so that they can completely control you. Philo talks about this. He puts it very beautifully. He says, the Creator created some archetypal idea conceived by the intellect, when he had determined to create the visible world, previously formed from that one which was perceptible only to the intellect, in order that in using an incorporeal model, as far as possible on the image of God, he might then make this corporeal world a younger likeness of the elder creation, which should embrace as many different genera perceptible to the external senses as the other world contains of those which are visible only to the intellect. So, and he says, and then this is Philo, this isn't Plato, but you wouldn't know it on first glance. He says, but that world which consists of ideas, it were impious to any degree to attempt to describe or even imagine. But how it was created, we shall know if we take for our guide a certain image of the things which exist around us. In other words, by looking at the question of creating a model of this eternal idea, you can develop at least a working hypothesis. Because it is the case. We are, in part, discrete creatures of senses. You know, as St. Paul puts it in Corinthians, we see through a glass darkly. And it is only afterwards we will see our Creator face to face. We will see only through a glass darkly, so you never are going to know everything perfectly as long as you're a mortal person. But does that leave you in the world of the Synergists and the Eleatics, which is you don't know anything, and you know you're basically at the mercy of might makes right or the triumph of the will? No, what both Philo and Plato addressed in a very, very beautiful way is that because we are created on the model of this idea, and we have mind, our mind can explore better hypotheses. As he says, we're not going to know it perfectly, but if we work out a hypothesis of creation, it's going to teach us something, and we can exert dominion over nature, which is right there also at the beginning of the book of Genesis. Plato puts it in a different way, because at the point he's finished developing, in a sense, this prelude, he says, but we can, because we are creatures of senses as well as mind, but because we have the sense part of us as well, because we're discrete creatures, mortal creatures, he says, all I can do is give you the most likely account of creation. You know, I'm not trying to tell you that I'm God and that I'm going to explain it to you perfectly, but I'm going to try and give you the most likely discussion of it. And this is really what Lynn talks about in terms of hypothesis and higher hypothesis and so on. You know, nobody is asserting that anything we say is the final truth on anything, because we're never going to know the final truth on anything. That's what Fukuyama and the Synergists say. You know, history is stopped. We know all there is to know. It's over. You know, and we can just, yeah, okay, party. But a Platonic outlook, a human outlook, LaRouche's outlook, it's a never-ending process of discovering less imperfectly the way the universe actually functions. And this is the idea which is essentially embedded both in the Timaeus and in Philo's discussion of Genesis. Now, what then Socrates stops Timaeus, who is an astronomer, who is describing the creation of the universe, and he says, this is a wonderful prelude. I really like the way you've started this. But then he says, but now let's get down to the substance. And what Timaeus then says is, well, of course, then the next question we have to ask is, for what cause did the composer compose the universe? Now, again, remember Schwaller's dead world of chaos and unknowability and mysterious dividing of one into two and so on and so forth. And compare that to what Timaeus then says, which is that the cause of the composition of the universe is that the composer desires to do good, that the composer has no envy. And so when he creates the universe, he wants to create something as most like himself as he possibly can. But of course, he's eternal, he's the same, and so on. He is creating something in the visible world, as Plato describes it, other, which is the discrete world of us, and so on. But still, the Creator wants to make the other as close to the same as possible. So this question of intention, why the composer is composing the universe, is absolutely fundamental. And it's the fundamental difference between a human outlook and why the Synergist outlook or the Eleatic outlook always ends up in fascism. Because the intention, the question of good in the universe simply does not exist in the world of the Synergists. So Plato in the Timaeus says this principle, why the composer is doing this. This is the supreme organizing principle of becoming, of creation, of generation, and of the cosmos. And actually, I was really quite surprised because Philo, in this discussion of Genesis, actually quotes from the Timaeus. He doesn't say Plato. He just says, I think that he would come to no erroneous conclusion if he were to say, as one of the ancients did, that the Father and Creator was good, on which account he did not grudge the substance, the other, a share of his own excellent nature, since it had nothing good of itself, but was able to become of the good. And that is a quote. It's a different translation than I would have, but if I had the original Greek, I'm sure you'd find it was exactly the same quote as directly from the Timaeus. So now then, Plato goes on to say that, of course, since he wanted to create the most good, most fair universe in his image, that which has mind will always be more good and more fair than that which does not have mind. Now again, you get to this beautiful parallelism in terms of Greek, because this is where this is mind. Nous, or, sorry, I get into Greek and can't get back into English. And this is where the word noosphere, you could spell it this way, or that the higher ordering principle of the universe is the mind of the Creator. And that is the image in which we are created, the mind, the nous. So Plato, Timaeus, states, this right in the outset of the Timaeus, that, and there's this beautiful discussion. He says, the cosmos, the universe, is that which is living, which is ensouled with mind, due to the foresight of the Creator. And foresight, again, is another Greek word. So it's all very poetic. It's extremely poetic. Foresight is the foremind, pro-noion, the foremind of the Creator. So again, when you see how much this idea infuses the Timaeus, the idea that Lynn develops in terms of the noosphere, just becomes immeasurably more richer. And of course, for the Synergists, there is no mind. There is no mind in this process. There's just the senses, and there's the unknowable absolute one, and that's all there is. So there you are, sort of floating, in Never Never Land, which is probably where the idea of Peter Pan came from. Yes, you still do. So this is one of the crucial refutations of the Synergists long before you ever even get to Synergism. Now, there's a world of material in the Timaeus which can be worked through for very happy months on end, and I'm certainly not going to try and go through that. But there's one other aspect in terms of what Plato develops in terms of the creation of the universe, which again just completely wipes the Synergists off the face of the earth. He next develops the body of the universe, and I'm going to skip that part. It's fun. This is where he uses the geometric mean he creates the ideas of the four elements and how earth, air, fire, and water, how you would unite them, and so on and so forth in terms of the tangible body of the universe. But then he says, but I'm now going to talk about the soul of the universe. And the soul comes before the body, but I had to deal with the body first. And what he does in his discussion of the soul of the universe, I think is really quite beautiful in terms of the ultimate refutation of this Eleatic Synergist problem of the man of the senses and the unknowable one. Because what Plato does at this point in the Timaeus is he says the soul of the universe is composed of three elements. He says, up till now, we've talked about the eternal, which he also calls the same. We've talked about the discrete world, the generated world, the created world, which he calls the other. So we got these two things. Obviously, they're very different. But he says the soul is composed of these two things plus a third. And the third is the compound, the forcible mixing of the same and the other, of the eternal and of the generated. So he forcibly mixes these together and creates this third compound, and then it's the three of these things together which create the soul of the universe. And he then goes on to develop a musical scale, the harmonic relations, and so on. I mean, it's beautiful to actually work this out. And then he discusses the composition of the soul, both from these harmonic intervals which he's created, and then he uses the same mixture and creates a metaphor of the soul in terms of the circle of the same being the outer stars and the circle of the other being the planets and so on. I mean, remember, he's composing the soul now. He's not trying to draw you a picture of the actual way the heavens look, but he's using the metaphor of music and the heavenly bodies as a metaphor to actually create the soul of the universe. Now, why is this so extraordinary? Because he says the construction of the soul is completed according to the mind of the Creator, Noos, again, and is then put into the body of the universe. And then what he develops is this. Because he's created the soul in this way, as a combination of the eternal and the generated, because of this, the soul is actually able to communicate with both. So the unbridgeable gap between the world of the senses, the discrete world, and the world of the eternal, the world of these ideas and so on, is actually bridged by the idea of the soul. And he's talking about the soul of the universe, but think of the metaphor in terms of a human being. I mean, what is a human being? You know, we are discrete. We have a physical body. We're going to live. We're going to die. We apprehend the world through our senses and so on. But we also have a mind, which, as Lynn discusses, can talk to Plato, can communicate with Plato's ideas. Plato is alive to somebody who knows Plato through his ideas in the simultaneity of eternity. And so even though we're corporeal and we're not physically going to live forever, our ideas could live forever. Our ideas can give meaning to somebody who's already passed on and so on. And that quality of man through our mind and through our ideas is, in a sense, the metaphor which Plato has described in terms of the creation of the soul. And the way he puts it in the Timaeus, so that, the soul essentially can communicate with both elements of nature. He said, when the construction of the soul had been all created to the mind of its constructor, actually this translation said, had all been completed to the satisfaction of his constructor, but it was actually had been completed to the mind of its composer or constructor. Then he fabricated within it all the corporeal, the body, and uniting them center to center, he made them fit together. And the soul, being woven throughout the heaven, every way from the center to the extremity, and enveloping in it a circle from without, and herself revolving within herself, began a divine beginning of unceasing and intelligent life, lasting throughout all time. Now, whereas the body of the heaven is visible, the soul herself is invisible, but partakes in reasoning and in harmony, having come into existence by the agency of the best of things noaton, knowable to the mind, and ever existing, eternal, and as the best of things generated, the other, knowable to the senses. Inasmuch then as she is a compound, blended of the natures of the same and the other, and the essence, which is the combination, these three portions, and is proportionately divided and bound together, and revolves back upon herself, whenever she touches anything which is generated, or anything which is ungenerated, created, she is moved throughout her whole being and announces what the object is, whether it partakes of the eternal or whether it partakes of the generated, and in what relation, where and how it when it comes about that each of these things exists and is acted upon by others, both in the sphere of the becoming and in that of the same, the ever uniform. And when the Father that engendered this perceived it in motion and alive, a thing of joy to the eternal gods, he too rejoiced and was well pleased. So, but this metaphorical representation of the idea of the soul as that which solves this apparently irresolvable conflict, which the Eleatics and the others say, which is that a mortal human being can know nothing of the truth, is addressed very, very beautifully by this metaphor. Now, that's just the introduction to the Timaeus. There's a whole lot more, but we're going to go home and sleep tonight, so we're not going to go through any more of the Timaeus. So there is not an irresolvable conflict in terms of this. Now, Lynn, in his own way, has put this in very relevant terms to what these kinds of ideas, your mind understanding principles, and then acting on the physical universe. Again, this is not this irresolvable contradiction that these lunatics try and present it as. The way Lynn put it, and this, of course, is the idea of powers, your power to comprehend a new idea and then act on the universe and see if it's a right idea. I mean, it gets back to Timaeus saying, I'm only going to give you the most likely account. I'm going to give you a hypothesis. And then let's take this hypothesis, and for decades or hundreds of years, let's work on this hypothesis and see how our society fares, and then let's develop more hypotheses standing on the successful hypotheses we've made before. Or the way Lynn put it, he says, the notion of powers, as this is illustrated by Plato, signifies the power to reach out to a discoverable universal principle existing beyond the reach of sense perception, and by that means to impose successfully, by action so informed, our will to change the order among observed phenomena. It is only through our uniquely human ability to change the behavior of the shadow world, that which you see with your senses, by willful means, i.e. powers. Let's put that one up too. The word power. Oh, that's all right. Which I think many of you know from Gauss and so on. Same root as dynamite or dynamic or dynamo and so on. But it means power. This quality of power. It is only through our uniquely human ability to change the behavior of the shadow world by willful means, powers, not accessible to perception, that we know with certainty that the real unseen world does exist as a subject of human knowledge. So take that, Schwaller Delovich. And then he says, Man is the only creature which can discover those unseen principles by means of which the order of experience within this shadow world of sense perception can be altered willfully. This difference from the beast is man's nature. This is the only true and lawful expression of human freedom, and so man must live free. And that's what the Synergists want to take away. They want to take away your power to be human so that they can herd you into a global fascist concentration camp of theirs and exercise their own psychotic view of the world on an ever-dwindling number of human beings who will still be alive. But then again, since they believe they actually have access to these mysterious, esoteric, unknowable things through psychotropic drugs and so on and so forth, they probably don't ultimately really care about reality. Yeah.
What were you thinking that?
That's from his thing on the pantheocons that he wrote, The Weird Religions of Chinese Empire, the pantheocons. So that's why when we printed this, we freaked out a whole lot of people. Because this question, which really, when you get down to the Synergists versus Timaeus, is the fundamental question of civilization and mankind. I mean, think of it. We're waging a campaign for president of the United States of America on the basis of the most significant epistemological fight of the last 3,000, 4,000, or 5,000 years. They've known it. Too few of us have known it because of Lyndon LaRouche and what he's unleashed, especially with the youth movement, which is dealing with ideas on this level. The release of this pamphlet was not just the release of this pamphlet, and the enemy knows it. The release of this pamphlet simply represents the, in a sense, visible representation of a new power, a new force which we're actually creating in the universe, which is the LaRouche youth movement and all of the other people who are going to be supporting Lyndon LaRouche's presidential campaign. So I think everybody should make sure that you save a copy of this, put it somewhere safe so that, 80 years from now you can pull it out and, you can show some young whippersnapper. This is what began to change. This is what began to change history fundamentally. This is when the adulthood of mankind actually began, when Lyndon LaRouche began to, destroy the infants once and forever. So I'll leave it at that. Have fun. Where's Freddie? Is he here? Does that answer any of the question you asked me last time about consubstantiality in the Timaeus? Yeah. Okay, you provoked me. All right, questions? If you ask the right question, I'll have to come up with another class next time. Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of curious about the Critias stuff. It seems like it's a continuation of this.
Right.
And, I just wonder if you knew anything about that. I mean,
is there Atlantis?
I just wondered, they kind of unfinished.
Yeah, I mean, it's, whether he just didn't have time to finish it, whether he, I have no idea. It really is intriguing. I mean, let's put it this way. It's one of those things I actually hope he really finished, and it's buried in the basement of the British Museum somewhere, so you can actually see where he's going. Because obviously the question of Atlantis is, a very interesting question. And the Synergists and the Theosophists just, they go to the moon on this thing. The question of ancient Atlantis and where it is and so on and so forth. All I can say about it is that what Plato was doing, as he does in the beginning of the Timaeus, and what he was obviously going to do with the Critias, is he's, whether he's talking about something real or whether he's talking about something metaphorical, what he's talking about is what is the shape, the power, the axioms of the ideas of a society, and were they successful in terms of the society continuing? Or were they unsuccessful, which led to the demise of the society? And when you're looking at ancient societies, because everybody's fascinated by this kind of stuff, Atlantis and, the fingerprints of the gods, and all this kind of stuff and so on. I mean, what you just have to steel yourself to is there's only one reason, to look at this material. Can you discover something about the quality of power, what kinds of ideas a civilization must have had to have allowed it to do something like build the pyramids? I mean, it's not interesting if you're looking for secret passages under the Sphinx or, the hermetic formula that you can gain by getting into, reading the hieroglyphics and so on, so you'll have greater powers over the, the mystery world and so on, or whether aliens built it. Actually, one of the things that ought to have really tipped me off a little earlier on Graham Hancock, admittedly. I mean, I knew it was wacky, but you're willing when you're first entering into a field to cut somebody a little slack, and so on. So I was cutting Graham a little slack there for a while. But really, what should have tipped me off is I got one book from the footnotes called The Serious Mystery. I can't remember. I thought, oh, that looks cool. I mean, it's about a star and so on. It's going to be about, and it says it's about ancient African civilization, the Dogon, and their knowledge of, something about the nature of Sirius and so on. So I got the book out of interlibrary loan. Thank God I didn't pay for it. And the thesis of the book is our knowledge, these ancient mysterious knowledge, came because we were earlier visited by fish people from the star Sirius. There you go. So, I mean, the minute you run into anything, like, Graham Hancock has a chapter on Edgar Casey, the theosophical psychic from probably next door to Pat Robertson in Richmond, Virginia, who's now passed away, who channeled to a pharaoh, i.e. had a conversation with the pharaoh, who told him that ancient Egyptian society was actually 10,500 BC. So, in answer to the question in terms of what he was going to do with the Critias and why he's talking in detail about the elaboration of this Atlantean society and so on, you just have to keep yourself very, very rigorously steeled. You know what Plato's method is, and you know that he's going to be developing some concept of how man's mind has applied powers to the development of society and so on. And that's really the only reason it's interesting. So that's what, but as I say, I hope that maybe the rest of it is really buried somewhere in the British Museum and we'll get at it someday. Yeah?
Is there any literature which we have that goes over the leadership of Solon?
Schiller writes a little monograph on Solon. I think it's the comparison of the laws of Solon to Lycurgus of Sparta, where he shows that the essential difference between Solon and Lycurgus is the idea of a republic versus the idea of a slave society and the image of man, which is exactly this question. There's not a lot written on Solon. There's, from the ancient literature, there's a series of books called, no, it's not Plutarch. I don't think he writes, does he write about Solon? I don't think he does.
He wrote Lycurgus, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think he writes about Solon because he doesn't write about people quite as far back as Solon. Diogenes Laertes writes a whole series of biographies. I can't remember what it's called. But once again, it's in the wonderful oligarchical controlled Loeb classical library, which means that it's the Greek and English. So there's these little tiny books. And, I think they're $20 a piece. And Diogenes Laertes, actually, at least that one's only 2 volumes. When you want to get something really interesting like, I can't think. Yeah, I can't think. Most of them are 12 volumes, so you need $240 to buy it and so on. But there is a section on Solon in Diogenes Laertes, which is the only actual real biography that I know about besides what Schiller identifies. But then you also just read his poems. And the most important one is the one Dave Shaven translated in Fidelio many years ago. I mean, that poem tells you more about Solon than most of what you're going to be able to find, which isn't much.
also in Diogenes' history, he has a section that goes on so on.
Yeah.
What's that? Again?
Yeah,
you can get a taste of it on the Perseus website. There's some sections of his history which go through so on. This one is a biography.
Yeah.
Wasn't Lynn exposing this Synergist movement in the 80s?
Yeah.
What was he doing with it then?
Well, we were looking at it sort of, all I remember, because I never really understood it. I never even sorted out that Synarchy was different than Anarchy until, 3 months ago, and I figured I'd better start actually thinking about this instead of just, connecting a few predicates to it. We were going after it in a couple of particular ways, especially in Mexico and South America, the Synergist movement there, and also in France. But it was never really from the standpoint that I think Lynn knew it, but it was never really from the standpoint that this is the universal highest ordering principle of the enemy operations for the last 100 years. And frankly, I think the reason we're going after it now, because I don't think this is a new concept for Lynn, but the reason we're going after it now is because Lyndon LaRouche thinks we're very close to having the power to actually defeat it. Because it's not the kind of thing you talk about academically, unless you're actually prepared to defeat it. So we took it on in a few of its particular national formations, like in Mexico, in France, and so on. And frankly, we didn't defeat it. And it was a period when, Lynn was getting carted off to jail ultimately, and so on and so forth. So, it's not, Lynn doesn't develop, doesn't bring to the fore particular historical elements of things for academic reasons. The reason it's the centerpiece of things now is because as he becomes president of the United States, we have the power to actually wipe these bastards out. And we didn't have that in the 80s. Yeah.
So you don't put much stock in the Freemasonry stuff? You just kind of think that's a kooky offshoot of the Synergists?
Yeah.
Makes some sense.
Yeah. They're into, the whole idea of the Hermetic tradition comes from the Greek name of the Egyptian god, Thoth, who, of course, these guys completely, bastardized. And the Greek god Thoth, the Egyptian god Thoth becomes the Greek god Hermes. And Thoth was the Egyptian god of letters, of learning, of science, of really the mind. He was the Egyptian god of, one of the Egyptian gods. He represents the ideas of learning and science and number and so on and so forth. So he becomes the Greek god Hermes, although Hermes often has different characteristics than Thoth. Mercury, the winged feet, Nike, that kind of stuff. That's the god of victory. But, it takes on a different characteristic, but it is Hermes. It is Thoth that the Freemasons are really referring to when they're talking about the Hermetic tradition, because it is the Synarchist, Freemason, and so on, mystification of Egypt, that it's secret, it's esoteric, it's this wacky world of Schwaller. You can only know it if you're an initiate. I think I read a quote on Sunday, which sort of gives you how they look at this thing. And this is the Freemasons. He says he's talking about hieroglyphics. He loves the Egyptian hieroglyphics because they don't just represent writing, like words and letters. The symbols are constructed according to these proportions and secret harmonies and so on, which speak to you in another esoteric way, and so on. So he says the nature of these symbols with their manifold meanings is such that they cannot be read in the linear sequential fashion that we read a book today. They demand that heightened state of consciousness that today some people experience after years of meditation practice, probably with a little help of LSD, in which the whole is perceived as a whole. Sometimes, if we are lucky, we may experience this with a painting or a piece of music, i.e. you don't know it, you experience it. If you know the experience, there is no mistaking it, and you will then know the psychological state required to read an Egyptian text as it must be read, even though you cannot expect to partake of it. And that's, Freemasonry isn't any more than that. You've got to be initiated into the esoteric, secret way of knowing things and so on. And then, of course, it's nice to have a secret society if you're organizing a conspiracy. That helps.
Instead of Nazi uniforms, you dress up in robes.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just intimidation, too. Just trying to do ridiculous intimidation. Like the emperor with no clothes.
Yeah.
You can't see it.
Yeah, that's right.
You'll know it if you walk.
That's right.
Do you think Plato knew how to sing bel canto? Is there any evidence of that?
He spoke Greek, yeah. I think Greek was probably bel canto, because if you've got the musicality in it, with the emphasis on these musical vowels. Actually, I once saw a reference, and I've never really been able to see anything more than just this one sentence reference, that the Egyptian priests sang 7 sacred vowels. And they sang them with such power, that audiences of tens of thousands, could hear them. So this idea of the vowels and singing and so on is obviously part of the musicality of a language. So Pythagoras probably did. And since Plato was a Pythagorean, probably. Yeah.
Have all the U.S. presidents been Freemasonry?
No, we've had a few good ones. And even, you might have one like Washington, who went through a Freemasonic lodge, frankly, I think for the purpose of using it as a way of organizing a conspiracy called the American Revolution. Washington did not have the worldview of a Freemason. And in fact, at the he either by the end of the 1780s or the early 1790s, he never entered a Freemasonic lodge again. Yet, the Freemasons will go to the anytime you go to the Capitol and you go to the book stand run by the U.S. Capitol Society, it turns out that it's basically run by the Freemasons. The U.S. Capitol Historical Society is run by the Freemasons, and among the things you can get is a painting of Washington in his Freemasonic apron laying the cornerstone of the Capitol. Never happened. And in fact, if you read the 2-point type on the back of it, they might admit that it never happened. It's just a representation of what they would have liked to have happened. So even though Washington was a Freemason, he was temporarily a Freemason, probably for other reasons, and did not have the Freemasonic outlook. Obviously, John Kennedy, who was Catholic, wasn't a Freemason because they don't let Catholics in. So no, they aren't all Freemasons, and even some who aren't Freemasons might still be no good. In other words, don't linearize it to if he's Freemasonic, he's bad. Don't look at it that way. That's the mistake that populists make all the time. He's a member of the Trilateral Commission. Now I know, that all I have to do is follow the things that he does, and I'm in on the conspiracy. Baloney. You got to look at what their intention is. And that's why Lynn is so powerful. He doesn't get bogged down in what club somebody is in. Colin Powell is probably a member of the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Commission. But at the moment, his intention is to fight the fascist Dick Cheney. Certainly, George Bush Sr. is a member of Skull and Bones, which is, a Freemasonic cult. But for the moment, Bush Sr. and his apparatus are on our side in the fight against Cheney. Believe me, when that fight's over, they will not be on our side any longer on the question of a new monetary system. Yeah.
So you're saying that Bush Sr. and his son are on our side?
No, I'm saying that Bush Sr. on the issue of Dick Cheney is on our side, and only on that issue. But think of it this way. Churchill hated the American idea, the idea of the American nation-state and sovereign nations. Roosevelt hated the British Empire, and yet they had to ally during World War II to defeat fascism. And you notice Lynn is referencing several times now in the last couple of weeks, the Roosevelt-Churchill alliance against the Synergists. I mean, he actually said it on BBC radio, and then he repeated it a little even more explicitly in the answer to one of the press conferences. So, I mean, he's stating explicitly that Churchill was opposed to the Synergists. Now, Churchill was a son of a bitch. And, probably drank, a whole lot of champagne when Franklin Roosevelt died. But there was an immediate strategic threat to the planet, and it was fascism. And on that basis, Churchill and Roosevelt allied. As the war was ending, they had bitter battles, where Roosevelt made very clear to Churchill he was going to use the power of the United States to smash the British Empire. And Churchill was going ballistic in these meetings. And Roosevelt died before he had the chance to do that. So, you can imagine what Lyndon LaRouche plans on doing, as soon as he has the power and the immediate danger of the fascists are gone. Believe me, we will not be fighting on the same side of any more battles with George Bush Sr. But it is historically specific in terms of this fight against fascism. You've got to be completely nuts to want to blow up the world, in order to achieve a fascist world empire. And George Bush Sr. may be a bastard, but he's not completely nuts. Now, it's not much more than that. Again, it's what I said before. You've got bad ideas. Imperialism's a bad idea. New World Order's a bad idea. Those ideas cause the collapse of civilizations and so on. But then you have a group of people who take a bad idea, take it into their intellectual weapons lab, and turn it into a weapons-grade pathogen. And those are the kinds of things which, let's say you create a pathogen which is 100% fatal, for which you have no cure, and you intend to never let it out of the laboratory. And then Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz start getting near the laboratory and are about to release this pathogen on the world because they actually think that with their triumph of the will they can control it or something like that. So, I mean, really, that's what these guys are like right now. They really believe there is no universal principles. They really do believe the triumph of the will is what runs the universe, and so if they just triumph their wills enough, they can manage whatever, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse they unleash. So, so then you've got other members of the establishment who, are not friends of ours, but they realize you don't want to release this weapons-grade pathogen out onto the planet. I mean, face it, Rumsfeld actually thinks you can do to North Korea what he did to Iraq. He thinks you can go in there and attack them and push them around, and they're going to surrender North Korea the way Iraq was surrendered. Well, it ain't going to happen. The North Koreans have already said if they think a preemptive strike against them is inevitable coming from the United States, they'll act first. And what they've said is they will send a intermediate-range nuclear ballistic missile to Tokyo. Not just Seoul, but Tokyo. Now, that's nuts. And even George Bush Sr. knows that's nuts. But Rumsfeld and Cheney, if allowed to stay in there much longer, will push until that happens. Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's just like I'm just asking if President Reagan was part of Freemasonic or something.
He wasn't smart enough to be Freemasonic. I mean, what Reagan was is he's sort of the example of somebody who has a certain traditional outlook for the United States, not too bright, at a time when the hardcore elite is trying to destroy even, certain traditional kind of banal values. I mean, let's face it, we just had Jimmy Carter and Paul Volcker, who had completely wrecked the U.S. economy. So a lot of people were saying, can we go back to normal now? And they thought Ronald Reagan was normal. He was more normal than Jimmy Carter, frankly. And Reagan, because he was World War II generation, had a certain worldview. LaRouche was able to organize Ronald Reagan to adopt LaRouche's strategic doctrine, called the Strategic Defense Initiative, and reject Henry Kissinger's doctrine of mutual and assured destruction. Reagan adopted LaRouche's policy in March of 1983. Never quite implemented it because he didn't quite understand the whole implications of it. But that actually freaked out the Kissinger crowd quite a bit. So LaRouche's attitude toward the presidency is that no matter what is occupying the presidency, who or what, right now we might have a what, I'm not sure we have a who, occupying the presidency, the institution of the presidency must be defended and shaped as best as possible to serve the interests of the nation. So whoever is president, Lyndon LaRouche is looking for a way to help the institution of the presidency. So, right now, look at the difference between Lynn and the 9 Democratic, morons. They want to attack George Bush for the intelligence failures. That's like attacking a pile of Plato for the intelligence failures. Dick Cheney can shape the Plato one day. Lyndon LaRouche can shape the Plato the next day. LaRouche is going after the active agent, which is Cheney. And none of the Democratic candidates, as Harley was saying, will touch Cheney with a 10-foot pole. So it's the institution of the presidency. Look, Richard Nixon ended the Bretton Woods monetary system on August 15, 1971. I joined the LaRouche movement the next day because this guy LaRouche was making a lot of sense right about then. And Lynn knew at that point that meant we were on a pathway to fascism. Not immediately, but he knew that this was the characteristic shift. We were going to become a parasitical society. So we had no love for Richard Nixon. Yet when they Watergated him, attacked him, we defended him because it was the institution of the U.S. presidency. In fact, I got arrested disrupting the Watergate hearings in 1974. Next time I'll bring my mugshots. You wouldn't recognize me. But, because we were defending the institution of the presidency, and we knew there was something else going on. We thought it was the CIA. We didn't quite have it right yet. We also thought it was Rockefeller, and boy, did we have that dead bang, because after Nixon was out, Ford became president and appointed Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president, and then Ford was almost assassinated. So we almost ended up with President Rockefeller there in 1975. Yeah, that's scary. But, Lynn knew that Nixon had adopted a policy, and again, he was kind of like silly putty. Maybe not quite as dumb as George Bush Jr., but not the active agent, and, had made an absolutely disastrous decision. Yet when the more powerful forces started playing games with the U.S. institutions and the presidency, LaRouche said, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to defend it. I remember even when Lynn was in jail, remember he went to jail the week George Bush Sr. got inaugurated. His first statements from jail were basically saying, I'm going to give George Bush a chance. I'm sitting there, you're going to give George Bush a chance? I want to kill the guy. He just put you in jail. There wasn't much room for thinking, that the chance was, well, actually, let me rephrase that. Lynn stated, for example, that the war with Iraq, the first Persian Gulf War, Bush was forced into by the Israelis. Now, I certainly wasn't thinking that in 1991-92, but what he said is that Bush would not have gone to war with Iraq except Israel said, we're going to nuke Iraq unless you do it. So Bush did it to, hold back the complete psychosis. So, even George Bush Sr., and remember, Cheney tried to get his preemptive strike doctrine, his new preemptive strategic doctrine, pushed through in the first Bush administration in 1991-92. And it was shot down by Scowcroft, James Baker, and Bush Sr. agreed with Scowcroft and James Baker. So we did not have a preemptive strategic strike doctrine 10 years ago. Cheney's been working on it since then and got 9/11 so we could finally get it. So, but, when you actually look at the real world, as the fight between good ideas, which is us, bad ideas, which is people like George Bush Sr. and so on, and then evil weapons-grade pathogens, which is the Synergists, you're actually dealing with a real world in which it's a battle of ideas, and Lynn is deploying very, very powerful ideas to actually change policy. It's not white hats and black hats. Any other questions?
Well, I have a little question specifically on Franco, because I don't see the direct connection.
On what? I'm sorry? Franklin.
Franco. Francisco Franco.
Uh-huh.
Because it's a little bit different as with the other dictators.
Yeah.
And but in any case, you can see the behavior was in the same direction. But my question is, which was the role of what you would call the Synergist bankers in that case?
I know very, very little about it, so I wouldn't do you much good giving you an answer. I mean, I would just say, though, that you're right in terms of that they are a little bit different. But think of it this way. Stalin was a little bit different than Hitler. But the process which led to dictatorship in Russia and dictatorship in Germany was started by the Synergists in both cases. And it doesn't mean they always have fingertip control over the process. Frankly, their first intention is to destroy a sovereign nation state. So whatever form the dictatorship takes is not their primary concern. They'd like to be able to control them, but they can't always. But I think we'll probably be writing a lot more about it in our literature as we write more and more about the Synergists. And I know there are people in our organization who do know a lot about it, and there may even be some people here who know about it. I just don't. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the Synergists having influence, the Synergist bankers having influence within Russia. I don't understand how Synergist bankers have influence within Russia, where Russia was a communist state by the time World War I ended in 1918.
Again, it's the question I said. It's the point. It's not so much what they end up with, it's what they want to stop. Russia was in the process of modeling itself on the American Revolution. The Tsar Alexander II, who was a contemporary of Lincoln, freed the serfs, in a sense, I think in the 1880s, but very much modeled on Lincoln. His economics minister, Sergei Witte, was studying Alexander Hamilton, was teaching American system economics for 20 years. He was giving classes to the last Tsar's brother. The last Tsar, what was that, who's the last Tsar? Nicholas II. He was kind of dumb. His brother had a little more potential. He might have been an Alexander, because the names keep going back and forth. But anyway, Witte was teaching classes.
Is this Sergei Witte or something?
Yeah. Was teaching classes to the brother of the Tsar. Actually, one of my friends, Rachel Douglas, found in the Library of Congress a copy of the handwritten lectures of Witte, written in Old Russian, of course, a Xerox of it in the rare books room. She reads Russian. She was able to get permission to Xerox it, and we got it back into Russia for the first time since the Revolution, and got it published in a Russian magazine. So it's now available again in Russia. But you see, what the Synergists cared first and foremost about is that Russia would not become another United States. It would not become a sovereign republic based on our ideas. They had to wreck that. So it was a top Synergist banker who financed the assassination of the Tsar. The Bolshevik Revolution didn't end, sort of like Hitler, didn't end up exactly where they wanted. They did not have complete control over the Soviet Union at any time after the very early stages. But they sure as hell had their tentacles in there. There's tremendous influence in Russia through various institutions, because what they wanted to do is to make sure that you had a world poised between two nuclear superpowers, the United States, where they had tentacles, and the Soviet Union. And think of the post-war period. Everybody in the post-war period was supposed to choose sides between a bankers-run United States and a communist Russia, which at times was influenced, was manipulated by them. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about the communist ideology, which is similar, which starts with the same axiom as the bankers. which is man is really just a creature of his opposable thumb. You know, Frederick Engels, that's what makes you a man, you know, is that you've got an opposable thumb and you can go do work and so on. I mean, the communist description, the rigorous communist description of man is really not a whole lot different from the oligarchical description of man. Now, that doesn't mean that that's what every communist or person in the Soviet Union believed, and in fact they didn't, because you had extremely creative scientists, you know, people who believed in a certain dignity of man and so on and so forth. But there was tremendous synarchist and oligarchical influence in Russia. Somebody like Gorbachev at the end was practically their puppet. Stalin was not their puppet, believe me. He got out of control, and you know, although he did a lot of damage, which I'm sure they were very happy about, he wasn't their puppet. But their influence is enormous, and actually we've written a lot about that. Some of it's published, some of it's not. But again, remember this, what Lynn said. Synarchism began on July 4th, 1776. Not because the Synarchist movement started then, but because at that point the fascist financiers knew they had something they had to crush, and in all of its manifestations, and make sure it didn't spread to other countries. That's how they deployed. Yeah.
This ties directly in with Dirty Birdie and Wells.
Yeah.
My throat hurts. Now, what is it? This seems to be an old fight, as you said. But how do we go from downright evil, children of Satan, as we see them now in their current form, right? And once again, looking at two forms of Plato, because yet there's still Plato on top of all of that. Dick Cheney's not
right.
the originator of this policy. Lynn said that Dirty Birdie's the most evil man of the 20th century. We're now in the 21st. Where are the people that are pulling the strings behind the people that are pulling the strings behind the people that are pulling the strings?
Well, I think that's what I think Lynn is pointing at now in terms of the Synarchists. Because remember what the intelligence files we've looked at from the 1940s and elsewhere point to. I mean, these are the highest levels of the Swiss, British bankers. This is the black oligarchy. I mean, these are the people who have, you know, like evil for the sake of evil. And what we're honing in on in terms of the Synarchist movement is you actually find the most intense concentration of people who actually are evil, ideologically, with their political policies and so on and so forth. So I think the more we develop on how the Synarchist operation has functioned, I mean, I frankly, you know, I sort of got a visceral sense of it when I saw this one quote from this guy, you know, who in the late 40s or 50s said, well, we're going to reverse the defeat of World War II in the 21st century. You know, I mean, these guys are real fascists. They hate mankind. They want to wipe out any institutional vestige of man in the image of God and, you know, reduce us all to our most, you know, their most bestial nature. Yeah.
So you're saying that the British and the Swiss bankers are the guys that play a huge role or something?
That's a concentration of them. Switzerland, Britain, Geneva. Where's the bank in France, though? The key Synarchist bank. Not Nice? Is that it? Nice?
Nice, the whole French Riviera.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Côte d'Azur.
Can.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to find them everywhere, but the concentrations will tend to be in old Europe. I mean,
So it's Project A versus Project Leviathan?
Yeah, I guess. That works. But again, even though we're looking at a particular organizational network, I mean, the Synergist movement was created in the 1870s, and you can trace various projects, like one of the top Synergists financing the assassination of the Tsar, and, the guys who put Hitler and Mussolini in, and so on and so forth. Never, never, never get bogged down on the structure. You always have to look at the idea. What is the intention of the person you're looking at? What is it they're actually trying to do? Where are they trying to go? And that's why it's fairly simple to differentiate between George Bush Jr. and Dick Cheney. Cheney has an idea of where he wants to go, and it's quite evil. George Bush. I was going to say George Bush Jr. has no ideas, so. Whereas then you look at a Colin Powell. Is he Lyndon LaRouche? Obviously not. But he's obviously got a different set of ideas. You can read his autobiography about Vietnam and so on. I mean, he's flawed. He's not perfect. But he obviously has different ideas, different intentions than a Donald Rumsfeld. And that's what Lynn always looks at, which is why he's able to... It's why he can actually affect things, as opposed to a populist, who creates structures and labels and then goes and attacks the labels, which have nothing to do with how policy is actually made.
If I may just interject for a moment. I want everyone here who's deploying tomorrow at 7:30 in the morning, including people who have reading day and people for the office day. We're going to have plans on this. We want to make sure that we work out the logistics properly for the deployment over to UCLA. So, Danny, 7:30, that's when the big hand is on the 6, and the little hand is on the little, between the 7 and the 8. Of course, why am I saying this? He doesn't have a watch. It's all digital.
Yeah.
So do you believe the Synergist bankers have given funds to George Bush Jr. and George Bush Sr. or something like that?
It doesn't work that way. It works more with ideas. I mean, in terms of shaping ideas. Now, money does come in. I mean, the 9 Democratic candidates, are basically in the palm of the Straussians, the fascists, and so on, because they need the money. So they use the money to control. But it's not like you pay somebody and he goes out and, follows your orders. That's not the way it works. Ideas. It's in the domain of ideas. Noaton. Yeah.
Just before people leave, we have a list out here.